Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to break down Ray Dalio's macro-historical framework to really make sense of our chaotic global economy. Look, if you've been watching the news lately and feeling like the world is just spinning completely out of control, you are definitely not alone. But what if all this chaos isn't actually random? What if it's literally part of a highly predictable historical pattern?
Okay, let's jump right into this by looking back at August 15, 1971. On that Sunday night, President Richard Nixon shocked the world. He completely took the US dollar off the gold standard. The very next morning, a 20-something clerk named Ray Dalio walked onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, absolutely certain the stock market was going to crash. But it didn't. Instead, the market surged by 4%, literally the exact opposite of conventional wisdom. So why did that happen? Well, because while this had never happened in Dalio's lifetime, it had actually happened many, many times in history.
To understand why conventional wisdom gets it wrong so often, we need a roadmap. So here's our agenda. We're going to cover the big cycle, the 5 forces driving it, diagnosing the empires, the US-China clash, financial adaptation strategies, and finally, our key takeaways.
Part 1. The Big Cycle Explained.
A 500-year pattern.
So, the absolutely crucial thing to grasp here is that empires act almost like living organisms. They have a predictable lifespan. Dalio's research team analyzed 500 years of data and found this massive repeating cycle. It always moves from a disciplined, hardworking rise right after a period of conflict to this decadent peak where people start living way beyond their means, and then it finally ends in a debt-fueled decline. A full cycle usually lasts roughly 250 years.
And this is basically the ultimate relay race of world supremacy and reserve currencies, meaning, the money the rest of the world actually uses for trade. We had the Dutch in the 1600s with the guilder, the British in the 1800s with the pound, and then the United States stepping up in 1945 with the dollar. The historical playbook is virtually identical every single time.
Part 2. 5 forces of change. What drives the cycle? So what fuels this massive machine? The source identifies 5 major forces driving world changes. You've got the money and debt cycle, internal political conflict, external conflict between nations, acts of nature like pandemics or extreme droughts, and of course, disruptive new technologies. But here's the truly alarming part. According to the data, right now, all 5 of these massive forces are converging and acting up at the exact same time.
Let's look at how the financial decline actually plays out. When an empire gets too comfortable, it starts piling on massive debt. Eventually, when it just can't pay that debt, the government naturally chooses the least politically painful option, right? They print unbacked money. This stealthily inflates the currency, and ultimately it just destroys the world's faith in that empire's money. It is a trap that has caught every single empire.
Part 3. Diagnosing empires. Checking vital signs. Just like a doctor checking your pulse, we can check an empire's health. Through centuries of data, Dalio found a rising power always invests in education first. That sparks innovation, which leads to trade and eventually military power. But, and this is a huge trap, the absolute last thing to die off is reserve currency status. Because it lags so far behind everything else, it kind of tricks a declining empire into thinking, hey, we're still healthy, even when the core fundamentals have literally been rotting away for decades.
This brings us to the classic dilemma: guns and butter. An empire has to balance funding its expensive military dominance abroad, the guns, while maintaining domestic prosperity at home, the butter. Once a country essentially runs out of money and has to start choosing between funding foreign wars or taking care of its own citizens, well, the internal decline has truly begun.
Part 4. The US-China clash. A historical crossroads.
Bringing this into the 2020s, the United States is currently in what the framework calls Stage 5 of internal decline. That is perfectly illustrated by an absolutely staggering $38 trillion national debt. This mountain of debt is accelerating inflation and dramatically widening the domestic wealth gap. To put that into perspective, the source points out that 40% of Americans couldn't even find $400 for an emergency expense without borrowing it. That is just a textbook recipe for severe internal political conflict.
And if we impartially place the current trajectories of the US and China side by side using Dalio's metrics, we see the classic historical pattern. It's a mature incumbent facing a rapidly rising challenger. The data neutrally shows the US struggling with heavy debt and deep political divisions. Meanwhile, China has basically followed the classic rise playbook to a T, heavy investments in education, soaring technological patents, and rapidly expanding global trade. History tells us that whenever these two lines intersect, tensions always peak.
Part 5. Financial Strategies. Adapt and Protect. So, how do we protect ourselves? Well, consider this jaw-dropping number. 80%. That represents the percentage of historical currencies that have completely vanished from existence. Just let that sink in for a second. 8 out of 10 fiat currencies, meaning government paper money not backed by commodities, have simply disappeared. It really proves that relying entirely on paper money is incredibly fragile in the long run.
Which perfectly sets up this famously provocative observation: cash is trash. Now, actually, scratch that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have any money in the bank. What it means is that while central banks are constantly printing more money to cover massive national debts, the actual purchasing power of your cash is being silently eaten away by inflation every single day. Holding only cash? That's a huge trap.
Okay, let's dive into a historical solution for this. Back in the 1600s, the Dutch invented the very first public company, the VOC, or Dutch East India Company. Before this, a merchant funded a single ship, and if it sank, boom, they lost everything. But by selling shares, they spread that catastrophic risk out across a whole fleet of ships. Today, we have to adopt that exact same mindset. You have to highly diversify your assets, building what Dalio calls an all-weather portfolio, just to ensure you survive when parts of the economic system inevitably fail.
And when paper promises fail, history shows us that humanity always runs back to gold. Why? Because it's literally the only asset that isn't simultaneously someone else's debt liability. Think about it. Your bank deposit is a promise from the bank. A bond is a promise from the government. But physical gold in your hand, that is nobody's liability. It is the ultimate 500 years safe haven when trust in paper money evaporates.
Part 6. Final takeaways. Preparing for the future. Let's wrap up with a thought that really shatters our modern complacency. For anyone born after 1945, we've lived through this incredible 80-year exception of relative global peace. And because it's all we know, we just assume it's the permanent state of reality. But zooming out over 500 years, this peace is a luxury. It is definitely not the historical rule. The cycles of debt, empire, and conflict are turning right before our eyes, exactly as they have for centuries. So, are you clinging to the assumption that tomorrow will be exactly like yesterday? Or are you preparing for the reality of history? I'm going to leave you with that final vital question as you think about how to navigate the changing world order all around us.